Hello, in this episode of Airs for Architecture I speak with Simon Henley, director of Henley Halebrown, about his designing, writing, teaching and research. The work of Henley Halebrown is varied, but it was their work on urban housing and the idea of beneficial building that we dwelt on.
Airs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Simon Henley, director of Henley Halebrown. Simon, can you introduce yourself a little more fully than that?
Yes. Well, I've been a partner at Henley Halebrown. Well, we set the practice up in 1995 in a deep recession. As I think probably with hindsight is often the case, that practice is a chance encounter, as it were. And of course that, says a lot about what's happened over the last, what is now nearly 3 decades. I've also taught for most of those years, and written. And I think that, hopefully that's a kind of healthy balance. Running a practice is running a business, but of course also it's a cultural pursuit, and one tries to hold all that lot in balance.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I like that. So you Henley Halebrown are what? Are they an SME or are they a large practice now?
We are about 25 people.
Okay.
And which is pretty much what we've been within about 5 years. We got to that sort of size, and we've remained very much that size. And that in itself is also probably just chance. But I think what it has meant is that we've stayed close to the work. And we remain curious about taking on projects, as opposed to there being that urgency to do lots of work.
Yeah. So I first came across your work when I was an undergraduate. I started in 98, so probably around the turn of the millennium, and that was under the moniker of Bush O'Henley. And it was housing work that I had seen, and I was looking at it alongside work of Surgis and Bates at the time. So you've always been kind of stuck in my mind because of these kind of looking through AR and AJ and building design and things like that at that time. And I was struck then by the kind of very thoughtful and sensitive architecture that you were producing. But I don't mean sensitive in a soft way, but I mean in a kind of contextual way. But also that it was innovative around everyday life and everyday culture. And how would you describe the work now? Has it followed that sort of trajectory?
I think we have. I've always been preoccupied with the experience that people have in buildings. Even going back to when we were students. And my thesis project, I was sharing a studio with somebody who was doing what I would describe as a mineral sustainable project. I mean, 30 years ago or thereabouts, and actually that was probably relatively radical at the time. And I was thinking that there's this equivalent, as it were, sustainable way of thinking about people. Somehow that kind of responsibility that we are now obviously acutely aware of in terms of the environment, I felt was kind of arguably even more important when you think about people. Of course, now we talk about the Anthropocene age, and perhaps that is a harder argument to make because, well, I guess the kind of privileged position that the human race is now in and the damage it's done makes it harder to sort of seemingly remain preoccupied with, I suppose, people. But I guess if you replace the word people, let's say, with humanity or something, then of course it's not about just facility. This is not about capitalism and people having what they want. It's about having an acute sensitivity to both our kind of psychological state and our social being, and how those two things are I guess, influenced and influence the built environment, building spaces.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's an interesting answer. I mean, so when we first got in contact, you sent me through some texts, and you sent me through this, which I'm very grateful for, and you sent me through this lovely one on not living in a Victorian terrace house. It sort of starts with a quote from Neave Brown. So this idea then of this, I sort of adopting a slightly critical position to the status quo, but not entirely turning it over in a kind of deconstructivist or a willfully daft way, as became the norm around the millennium, I think is what jumped out at me. And you see that as being related to this social kind of objective of your architecture.
I think so. I mean, if I understand what you're saying, there's for me, there was a great kind of purposefulness about a period of work after the Second World War. It's this sense that, very literally, people had given their lives to the war, and there was a kind of reciprocal. Well, it was a leveling thing. It was there was clearly in that kind of scenario, everybody's equal, as it were. And after the war, there's this obvious huge drive initially by the first Labour government in setting up the welfare state and in building housing and schools and health centres. But actually, it's something that carried on and was driven by politicians of all persuasions. And so for a period of time, architecture was what we might call acutely beneficial. It was doing necessary things, but it was doing very good things for society. I think to a certain extent we've lost our way in that. We've forgotten the commitment to each other, even in the context of many kind of there is a huge social awareness, but it's somehow tempered by a late capitalist society that we live in. But I also that sort of social ambition that I could see in that post-war architecture, and I could see also in sort of post-colonial emerging nations, there's this real the architecture plays an important part, but equally it's that you could go back to the arts and crafts, and you see something which we sought to emulate very directly. Let's say in our project for Talkback, where we were adapting a roughly 100-year-old building, and the ability to employ craft in making pieces parts of the building which would otherwise potentially have come out of a catalogue, doors, windows, door handles, light fittings, laying floors in very sort of rudimentary ways. Every aspect, the building was basically handmade at a point when that was quite unlikely. And the working environment that we created was more about the cloistered garden that it surrounded. And it was more like a kind of collegiate research environment. So in other words, it was in a way typologically, materially, and so on, being radical. Let's just say being radical by actually resisting many conventions and ideas that, in a prosaic way, now in the working environment and in school design and in various areas, they're now accepted as completely kind of normal things to be aspiring to do.
So there seems to me, and I wonder to what extent your experience of studying at Liverpool in the late 80s, after it had sort of been ransacked as an industrial city, I wonder how much that's played a role in this idea, because you seem to be suggesting that architecture is inherently a socializing force. That's meant to be its role, and that obviously, to me, seems to be part of that post-war spirit in architecture. That architecture is incredibly efficacious in its social function, which doesn't seem to be necessarily something that people believe, or certainly haven't believed until quite recently. And yeah, so I was wondering if there was anything about, I mean, so Liverpool School of Architecture at that time seems to have produced a lot of architects who have this kind of civic mission. And I wonder if there's anything, if you recall anything about that experience, that time there, that was instrumental in that. I mean, who was head of school? Do you remember?
So John Tarn was the head of school. And I think he researched housing. Then also during our time, Simon Pepper was the head of school, and he had done a lot of research with Mark Swennerton on housing. So that played an important part. There's a chap called David Thistle. Hang on, you'll have to have to chop this up a bit. Oh God,
no, not at all. I mean, it's just
anyway. It's really annoying because I want to name him.
Liverpool School of Architecture has done this before, though, hasn't it? It produces these generations of kind of very important people. I mean, obviously, the wartime period, Liverpool becomes enormously powerful. In the post-war period, obviously, and then I didn't realize until recently that in the Liverpool School of Architecture in the 80s was starting to to plant the seeds, I suppose, of this new type of architecture which Henley Halebrown kind of represent, which is a highly urban, very rich sort of counterpoint to what my wife calls the WTF, the what the fuckitecture of kind of the millennium period, of the kind of just like shape-making daftness.
I think if you take Liverpool at face value, and you take Liverpool at face value in the 1980s, it was physically great expanses of the city were in ruins. They were deserted, but magnificent. You know, magnificent in the docks, magnificent in the financial district, and magnificent in some of the incredible Victorian suburbs around the great parks with palm houses and so on. So there was, and it was all very well mannered, in terms of the streets were well proportioned, the buildings were well proportioned, the figure ground was clear. These are very strong districts and neighborhoods of buildings and spaces, public spaces, terraces of buildings, not always grand, but well ordered, as it were. Of course, then into that there was various remarkable buildings like Gilbert Scott's Church, and help me, the
Gilbert's Church,
Gilbert's Cathedral. So there was quite a lot of fine modern architecture as well.
Yeah. I mean, so how does this then end up being? How do you end up getting from Liverpool all the way out to this point in Henley Halebrown? Where did you work afterwards? And then so Busho Henley in the mid to late 90s, and then Henley Halebrown Roehampton, and now Henley Halebrown. Yeah,
I mean there were a number of other partners, and not for insignificant amounts of time. The continuity is Gavin Halebrown and me, who have worked together now, studied together since 1986 and worked together since 1995. Interestingly, Gavin went after we finished at Liverpool, he went to work in Japan for a year, and there's definitely a sensibility in some respects in terms of the craft and the making and a different cultural perspective. For me, there's a couple of things I would say, as well as the Liverpool as a city, as a kind of influence, and some of the tutors as an influence on both of us. I went to India at the end of my second year and went to, well, various places, but particularly went to Rajasthan and went to visit a lot of the fort palaces. So in this kind of complex, well, in this incredible landscape of desert and mountains and lots of sort of smaller cities, as families broke up and fought each other, they built buildings on adjacent mountains, sort of besieged each other. But the architecture was interesting because the architecture was distinctly cultural and responsive to culture and responsive to the climate. So you'd have Charlie screens, perforated stone, allowing ventilation to pass through, but also to obscure the view of particularly the women within the palace. Of course, we live in a very different world, but that was work. These facades were working both culturally and environmentally, and by the same token, also the articulation of kind of big string courses, which are called shaja, which would shed the monsoon rain. So these incredibly delicate buildings, responsive to the climate and responsive to the culture, would almost explode out of these extraordinary, heavy, rocky settings, these mountains, which to a certain extent were as found, but to a certain extent also hewn in the process of making the fortification. Yeah. So that was for me a really important experience. And then in my first year of my part two, I went to study in the States. I went to study in Oregon, in Eugene. And Eugene was a kind of, it's where hippie culture began. And it's where Christopher Alexander was doing, although before my time, did various bits of research, where people who'd worked with Louis Kahn were then teaching. And then there was a kind of third group, which were broadly speaking drawn from Ivy League, and they were, interested in deconstruction, feminism, and so on. So whilst it was quite a big school by comparison to Liverpool, and in some respects, we felt perhaps not as sophisticated, or maybe one felt rather arrogantly that the students weren't as sophisticated, which may or may not have been the case. But actually, we were exposed to an incredible range of interests, and even though actually I wasn't taught by anybody who worked for Kahn, and I'm not sure I was taught by anybody who researched with Christopher Alexander, but these things just started to get under your skin, I suppose. And then I traveled a lot and went around, traveled kind of the whole perimeter in a lot of North America. And particularly things which I guess have again stuck with me. One is the landscapes around Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada, where there's the greatest intensity of national parks, and again, and also Indian reservations. We went there and we went to see places like Betatarkin, Mesa Verde, Checker Canyon, where we went to see the cliff dwellings. And again, one sees, perhaps parallels with what one saw in Rajasthan. The Anasazi Indians who lived in Mesa Verde, they cultivated the mesa top because that's where the precipitation at the height created the most fertile land. They then climbed over the top, off the edge, down into the canyon, into the cliff dwellings, and lived there. And the cliff dwellings were extraordinary because sort of the simplest lesson about the environment you could get, that low angle sun would penetrate under the kind of overhang and would sort of heat up the back wall and radiate heat into this little settlement that perched in that hollow. But of course, in summer, the high angle sun would be cut off, and the overhang would shade settlement from the intense sun, the heat of the summer sun, and things like so this kind of the way the way the Indians were building in India, the way the Anastasi Indians were living and building in Midwest. There were lessons which certainly stuck with me. And then we went to visit people. There was a lot of people we went to visit, but the work of Louis Kahn was the work that really kind of struck a chord.
Which is sort of monumental and has that similar monumentality about it as well, but a very kind of refined civic monumentality, not in a kind of brutalist tradition, not in the kind of overscaled hypermodernist, international modernist, but a kind of elegance to that.
Of course, he's building rooms. He's one of the things which is so beautiful. Again, is this correlation between matter and sort of social structures. I mean, often his buildings are kind of organized from a primary space, and it's something which is undoubtedly kind of rubbed off on us and our work is that sense of human desire or the inevitability to gather and to recede and to experience life alone and as a community. But then that, you know, so that relationship between humanity, social life, typology, and material plays out beautifully in his work. And again and again, he's exploring models of plan types that correlate with, I suppose, human scenarios, whether it's education, work, religious, religion, and so on.
I mean, do you see your own work as being, in that way, very particular to the function that their initial function, that they are designed principally for that one use? So that, for example, I mean, so when we were back and forth with various suggestions about what we could talk about, and you talked about this idea of, you know, that there's certain ideas that you've kind of suggested to me. Typology and concentric plans were two other things that you were talking about. But this idea of the social dimension of architecture and the matter of architecture seems to be really, really intrinsically important there. And this idea of craft and tactility. So you talked about the Talkback project. Again, that seems to be another aspect, another reflection on this idea of craftedness, and tactility. I mean, was there a strong phenomenological background to your work? Is this is this sort of like Johanni Palasma is a bit after, I suppose, you, but you're learning? Probably, well, certainly not Palasma. And to this day, I'm not sure I fully understand the meaning of phenomenology, although I think we're probably quite good at it, if you see what I mean. Yeah. I mean, that's what I would say. I mean, that I'm kind of interested in the way that Henley Halebrown's work does seem to be about the stuffness of architecture. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And isn't that just for not, I mean, I'm probably offending a lot of people here. Stephen Hall will be turning in his, no, he's not dead yet, but yeah, I assume that's what phenomenology has sort of become. I think we're acutely aware. I mean, I think it comes back to the person, and maybe it's not so much social, but we have, our senses, and when writing about the facade and why we should make facades, how we might think about making facades in the future. Often, so the discussion will be sort of technical, but actually it is something to be experienced, and it's a threshold, but it's between inside and out. And in fact,
it's often the place in which, or the part of the building in which these days, so where most of the experience plays out. You were saying about to what extent there are buildings sort of quite, I guess, precisely related to their function. I think so many buildings, well, on the one hand, so many buildings these days are generic. Their functional sort of the space standards for buildings are highly prescribed. There are fairly small margins for sort of expanding and contracting, as it were, both the plan and the section of lots of typical buildings, whether it's housing and schools and so on. So interestingly, that it seems that threshold between inside and out is, well, it is in a way it almost mirrors what happens in the human, in the sense of we look out and we see and we hear, and we touch and we taste, and those are all things which are kind of between us and the world. As opposed to our sort of autonomous biochemistry that's going on within, or the world outside. And I think you could say that in a way, a building is doing that. It might be facilitating that or heightening those experiences, but it has that capacity, it's where to sort of to mimic the human experience in that sense.
Yeah.
And therefore to be an extension of that human experience, and to inform that human experience. But I wouldn't say that our buildings are in some respects, I think there are patterns in our buildings which cross use. So one could look at a school like Hackney New Primary School, a housing project like Copper Lane, the little co-housing scheme, or the office we made for Talkback. They're all very different scales, and one of them is an adaptive reuse of an old building, and the other two are new buildings. But they are exploring similar ideas about concentricity, that not that literal circularity, but how one kind of gathers and moves away from something which is recognizably shared, which of course is cultural. We presume that people do relate to each other, but I actually think that buildings are a crucial part in us even realizing that we do relate to each other. You put a group of people in a room and a party might happen. You put people in a square and a protest occurs. In the absence of these spatial structures, these things are harder to imagine how they might happen. Even when somebody says something like, well, a tree, standing under a tree is potentially a kind of prototypical classroom, but it is because it exhibits architectonic properties of defining a certain amount of space and providing a certain amount of shelter.
I think that's a really interesting idea. I mean, this is that Hannah Arendt's idea about the space of appearance, isn't it? That certain implicit in her idea about social power is that when people gather together, they gain power. It's what they call three-dimensional, Stephen Luke's calls three-dimensional power. And it's a kind of counterpoint to ideas of power being imposed, something that is only imposed. It's one-dimensional, or as the Yanks call it, a zero-sum game. Like, I've got power, so you can't have power. And so there are certain spaces which make that social power more likely to occur. And good buildings will do it. The one I always think about is the Glasgow School of Art, the Mackintosh building at the Glasgow School of Art, which had that strange, mysterious capacity, poetry about it.
Yeah, but both in terms of coexisting, maybe in those studios and walking up and down the corridors and using the staircase, but then gathering in the lecture theatre. I suppose you couldn't quite call it gathering in the library, but the library is does gather people together in a common interest.
But it was also the way, so I thought it was just a remarkable framing of human activity.
Yeah.
That as you walked through it, you encountered people having experiences that it sort of helped you understand a little bit more about the experience that they were having as a student, as a teacher, as a janitor, whoever it was. But also the building operated publicly in a kind of, I mean, maybe it will do one day if they get £100 million together, but operated as a way of kind of organizing the city. People knew that part of the city, like the city was navigable.
Because of that building.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
the building, even though it wasn't, it wasn't super razzmatazz, it wasn't covered in zinc and it wasn't stupid height and it wasn't oversized. It was big, but it wasn't, it was polite, but it had something about it that it was giving to the city. And I think this is something that I wanted when I first wrote to you, that I was really interested in the way that you're building. So the one that won the RIBA National Award recently, it's a kind of group of 3 buildings, isn't it? Or 3 schemes.
It's
Wilmott Court, Taylor and Chatto Court, is that right?
Yes, it's Taylor and Chatto are on one site and are 3 buildings, and Wilmott Court is on another site and is a single building. They're about 300 or 400 meters apart, and they were commissioned at the same time in terms of creating some homes on the edge of a 1950s London estate.
But they've got a really interesting language to them. There's a bit of Aldo Rossi. There's a bit of kind of, which is a compliment.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's fair, but there's certainly something of that 80s postmodernist about some of the facades. And then there's certainly a post-war kind of civic housing language to it as well. And then it's got scale. They've got scale as well. So they're doing a very kind of urban game as well. And maybe I would love to hear about kind of where this comes from. What was the kind of dynamic that was at play?
They're almost opposites, not necessarily in where they come from in terms of histories of architecture, but typologically. Taylor and Chatto, although that sounds like 2 things, is 3 things, and it's effectively 3 villas. They're quite different in scale, they're quite different in certain aspects, but they are, it's very hard to do this without pointing at drawings. They sit on the southern edge of the estate, with buildings forming 3 sides of a kind of a square that a courtyard that was never a courtyard. So sort of the natural thing to do was to place a building on the southern edge and complete the courtyard and relate to the street to the south and the Victorian terraces and streets beyond that to the south. But then, of course, there's we didn't want to massively overshadow the courtyard that we were creating. So quickly it becomes 3 pieces and allows the light through, also allows you to physically walk through on the west side. And then we just started to alter the geometries of the plan. But broadly speaking, there are the building to the west is a pair of dwellings stacked in certain ways. The one at the right hand east end is effectively a stack of single dwellings, and in the middle a group of 9, or a terrace of 3, forming a stack of 9 homes. And you've got maisonettes at the bottom, maisonettes at the top, lateral flats in between. But crucially, to find a language which seemed sympathetic to the Georgian brick terraced houses to the south, we orientated the galleries, the kind of outside spaces that are prescribed for housing these days in London, to the east and the west and the north. So to the existing landscapes, to the estate, to the sort of accidental landscape, parkland that comes with post-war housing scheme. So it has these rather grand orders to east and west and north, and it's sometimes circulation space, and it's sometimes private outside space for the homes. And it then evolves as a kind of the 2 languages of making rooms out of brick and making outside spaces out of frames. Whereas Wilmott, the other one, is sort of I call it a palazzo. I mean, that might be a stretch, but it is essentially a single block that pretty much occupies its whole site.
Yeah.
It's has a more monumental relationship to the street, which in the first instance is actually just moderating the proximity of homes to the city. So one creates a loggia. In fact, as you might describe, the three primary arcades on the villas, they are loggias. Here, the loggia wraps round more sides of the building and actually keeps going as a kind of traces projecting string courses through a third of the four facades, and is doing a structural job of holding up the brickwork on 3 out of 4 facades. But on the east and west and on the kind of busier roadsides, of course, it's both creating a kind of theatrical relationship between the private domain of the home and the city, in the sense that it's inviting people to participate in the public realm, but from, as it were, that initial threshold. But at the same time, of course, it's also creating a great deal of privacy, and so that it's balancing that privacy and that civicness of.
Yeah.
And I think because one of the things that, as we have over the years done, well, one theatre, a number of health centres, and of various offices, schools, and housing, we've borrowed, as it were, from one use to another, and seen in a way no difference. That they're all on one level, in a way, you can't quite stick this label to every building, but on one level, everything is public.
Yeah,
everything is civic, but everything is deeply sort of human and personal in the way it deals with that kind of solitary individual who's one of a number of people who encounters this building, whether they live there, work there, go to school there, just visit it.
very beautiful and elegant description. It makes sense of what you were talking about. I'm kind of want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about this concentric plan, because I think it's a really fascinating idea, and I'm not sure I fully understood it, but I really like this idea. You mentioned in one of your notes to me this idea of the thick perimeter of a building, a third liminal space between interior and city landscape, which I think certainly is really clear in that project, but is clear in a lot of the. I mean, it's quite interesting thinking about the relationship of your work to something like the mesa homes of the indigenous Americans, and the potential influence of that. I mean, that very vernacular form of architecture. Do you see your work having some kind of obligation towards what you might describe as normative urban building culture? Like, is that something that when you're tempted to go a bit weird, you're like, no, we need to step back, because this is folks' homes. This is where people live. They want, Londoners want to see houses that look like houses for Londoners, not houses for, I don't know, people in Abu Dhabi or.
Well, the climate does undoubtedly. You cannot just disregard the climate in the same way you can't disregard the way that things are built, and can't disregard gravity.
Well, you say you can't, but like 90% of the buildings in London going up at the moment clearly are.
Oh, yeah, sorry. No, I'm not saying that you can't. I'm saying we don't think you can.
Yeah.
And so
there's a kind of moral position, a social position there, isn't there?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's an ethical. I think there's as many ethical decisions made in the design of a building, if not more, than aesthetic. And actually, the ethical ones are often easier to explain, because aesthetics is often quite personal, and it's a privilege in a way to be able to design a building and to have the time to choose for it to be a certain way, and the opportunity to make something a certain way. But it's not really a privilege to get a building to work. I mean, and when I say that, I mean that I do mean that in a kind of meta functional sense, because of course, just talking about whether a building works sounds utterly dismal. I mean, it sounds a bit like unprofessional to say it's dismal, but of course we expect a building to work. But interestingly, the way that buildings increasingly are commissioned is as they're sort of skin tight to the function, and inevitably that shortens their lives. And so this kind of preoccupation that Gavin and I share about the climate as a palpable, experiential if people participate, if you create buildings that people actively understand and use, both environmentally and socially, yes, they may not, they should and can equally be technically engineered to be metrically sustainable or whatever, but actually that's the engineers are driving a certain type of sustainability, which becomes at its most often and at its worst completely abstract. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to dwell too much on this thing about sustainability, but I think it's simply because right now it's become such a pressing issue, not just moral, for humanity, it's an issue, but it's now become sort of politically an issue. It's become, in terms of education, it's become an issue. In terms of communication, it's become an issue. You can't not talk about it to the point which it's almost suffocating. But more often than not, the answer seems not to lie in the architecture. It seems to lie in the engineering, in the abstract properties of it. But we want to bring it back to a place where it's recognizable, it's tangible, it's visible, and it's something that people can participate in. And in the same way, we want people to recognize the social value in a building, the potential for it to be social infrastructure, rather than, as often people now seem to be preoccupied with, the architect's contribution to social value as being in process. Now, I'm not saying that, clearly the who is involved does influence the what it becomes. But if the who it involves doesn't influence the what it becomes, which is probably as likely an outcome, then the social value is lost in the process and not gained in the physical thing. I do think we need to concern ourselves with the sort of social value of the artifact that is the building that we leave behind.
I think that's amazingly good. So I've been talking to a number of architects through this thing and elsewhere who've made this point frequently, that, so I think someone said, I don't know if it was Charles Holland, maybe, activists don't get paid. So training architecture students to be activists is not very kind, in a weird kind of way. But I do love this idea that you talk about this, the social value of good design, like to be a good designer, and you mentioned facades earlier and elevations, and it was a point that Alan Powers made, which is that is actually how most people encounter the building. So the fact that we ignore the facades is, in a way, to ignore the public. I know they don't encounter it as a two-dimensional thing, but that's how you work it out.
Yeah,
using your imagination. So I really love this.
So many, so many modern buildings are clad, and they're clad because they have to be, as it were, because it's a problem. It's literally a sort of a problem to solve, to separate the inside from the outside, to meet certain performance criteria, and probably to brand the building. But that's, those aren't really the things we should be concerning ourselves with when we make a facade.
No, so I've been thinking recently quite a lot since the external examination at this school this year. I've been thinking about, there's a lot of this drive. You talked about technology. And so, you overclad a building because technically that works, that does the job, and then aesthetics be damned kind of thing, or design be damned to a certain extent. I mean, is that there's this kind of ethic of technology now which seems to be absent. Like there's no philosophy of technology and how our technology might be applied to architecture. So far as I can see, nothing comprehensive. And so you end up in this situation of tension between the engineer or the technologist and the architect. But your project seemed to eschew that. So how are you working this? Like, who are you? You must have great clients, and you must have a really, really good structural engineer. And is that at the heart of it? Is this part of how good buildings occur?
I think we do have pretty good clients, but we also have, and we have great collaborators and so on. But you don't always get good clients. You don't always get good collaborators. And so I'm not sure that always denies us of making a good building. I mean, I guess that's partly down to the group of people that work with Gavin and I and their capacity, as it were, to cajole people do things better in certain ways and to see opportunities. For example, when we designed the student housing at Roehampton University, I mean, there's so many things one could talk about, but that project it has a very conventional concrete structural frame, but we were in the grounds of a grade 2 star listed Georgian villa. We were near to a series of grade 2 star listed sort of slab blocks, mini unité d'habitations by Bill Howell and others when they were at the LCC. And so we had this kind of very important architectural setting. Of course, we had this incredible landscape setting. The plan came actually, as it were, from the landscape. The garden of the house that survived and the garden that was built within the house that was demolished 100 years ago when those two gardens were merged. But so we placed the three buildings as in relation to that. You know, the master plan, as it were, comes from that. But then the buildings themselves, they're brick. They're made of brick walls, as in the facades are brick, and they're freestanding, load-bearing brick walls. In fact, those buildings are kind of brick ruins, or rather, they're contemporary buildings wrapped in brick ruins, which are, completely independent of the inner structure. And that, I guess, so I said that because that wasn't in the brief. It was possible because we were able to demonstrate that building, traditional hand-laid, load-bearing brick walls was not on the critical path. So you could build the rest of the building and you'd be sort of almost ready to open it, having, it got airtight and it'd been, M&E and the interior, it'd been fitted out, everything would be done. And the wall, the construction of the walls would effectively catch up and coincide with the conventional program for completing the construction of the building. And in that, because of that realization, because of that opportunity, we were able to make those walls a certain way. They then have their technology is kind of what brickwork does, if you know what I mean, as opposed to more often than not what brickwork appears to do. I'm not sure I explained that very well, but that was opportune. It was definitely not in the brief. There's nobody involved in the project that would have initially sanctioned that idea, but because it was possible, and in fact there was no real reason to resist it. There was the one, I guess, because we were in a heritage setting, there was an expectation that the brickwork would be good, but that didn't mean say the brickwork would be built the way it was, and didn't mean we would build the building the way we did. But that kind of excuse of the heritage setting and the opportunity of the critical path, or taking the walls off the critical path, opened up a whole seam of creativity, and in a way has kind of certainly helped me, but I think others in the office, to to think much, much harder about making facades, because before that, we'd been doing some of the things we say we were doing. Then we did it and really kind of recognized what we were doing and have built on that recognition. But one looks back at earlier projects like Talkback and St Benedict's and so on. And I'm not talking about load-bearing brickwork, but I'm just talking about that threshold between inside and out. And that role of that, as you said earlier, that third space between the outside and the inside becoming kind of the essential part of the building, which in the case of Talkback really was, because everywhere were adapting a building. And what became apparent very quickly was that the place where we would have the greatest, I don't mean this in a kind of just making change for, like you said earlier, it's not about being sort of willfully altering a building, but there was a series of buildings which were introverted, just off Oxford Street, and to turn them into a kind of a research establishment for a TV company, and to really draw people out and make them visible and create the culture, that 2-meter zone of what the facade and the decks, what then became the multi-story cloister, is the thing that conjures up not only the atmosphere and the character, but literally facilitates through new infrastructure the ways of moving around the building, the chance encounters, the meeting, as well as the kind of healthiness and just the relationship between being outside as opposed to presuming that we will be inside.
Which you also see in Hackney New School as well. I mean, you see it in all your work, and that's what I find quite so interesting, that it's this kind of constant beat that runs through the work, which I find very rewarding. How do you, just to finish, because we are coming towards the end, but as a teacher of this, as a writer of this, I can understand it, but as a teacher of this, how do you, when the impetus behind education so much now, particularly in higher education, is towards a kind of activism and a process orientation which is not necessarily designed to result in robust architecture which corresponds to human urban built environment needs. How do you go about teaching it? How do you go about, is it just a very traditional process of sitting and drawing, or is there some, I mean, obviously there's not a magic trick, but how would one go about organizing something like this?
If I ran a school of architecture, I think I'd probably close it and take everybody to see your buildings. The field trip is I think, because of the kind of economics of being a student, there's huge pressure to not go on field trips, to not visit buildings. But that intimate knowledge, I mean, you've got to visit it with a tape measure and a compass and paper and scale rule, and you've got to survey it in some way, shape, or form. You've got to draw it, and you've got to you've got to really understand it. I think that's a huge thing, and I see students who perhaps we all, when you're just learning, you are literally just learning, but their grasp of the physical properties, the dimensional properties, the atmospheric, the role of light in reality, these are often things which they've sort of not experienced or recognized because they haven't been to see really good examples of these phenomena. Phenomenology. These are phenomena which they're not familiar with. So one thing I think is, it's been a huge. It's really important when we have managed to take students to important places like Giancarlo De Carlo's work in Urbino, all of the Paulistas' work in Sao Paulo. We've been to America to see a lot of the great work in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, whatever. And I could go further, but in terms of in a teaching environment, We did one year, we set the students the useless facade as the whole year. And as I was essentially, starting to explore through studying other people's facades and starting to understand what they were doing, and then developing facades, and then developing buildings almost behind facades, and developing a lot of the ideas that I had already written about in the essay on facade studies. And then another one was post-consumer inconvenient farm building in an urban setting, which turned out to be a library in a post-war housing estate. But what it was doing was talking, often I think we're drawn back to what extent, how simply can you, how elementary can the building of buildings be? How direct and intimate can the relationship between inside and outside be? And how clear can the social idea of the plan, type, form be? These are all things which, wherever sort of society and culture and style and fashion takes us, these are fundamental questions that one can just keep asking and keep exploring.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Beautiful point to finish on.
Thanks.
Out with a bang. Thanks to Simon for speaking with me and for sharing texts and ideas so freely. See the podcast description for links to Simon's numerous online persona and for links to some recent articles on Henley Halebrown's work. Share this episode if you fancy, and thanks for listening.